Welcome to the deep dive. As we look ahead to hurricane season, particularly the one starting June 2025, there's this question that keeps coming up, and it's really central to the source material we've been looking at. Are hurricanes actually getting stronger, packing a bigger punch?
It's a really critical question, yeah. And the implications, they go way beyond just people living right on the coast.
Absolutely.
When you think about communities, economies, even further inland, understanding this trend is, well, it's vital.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We're going to take this source material. We have an article called Stronger Hurricanes, Science, Trends, and Preparation, and just pull out the key knowledge. We want to get a handle on if they're getting stronger, why that might be, what the future looks like, and maybe most important, what you can actually do to prepare.
Exactly. Not just dry facts, but really understanding the core issues.
Yeah, let's dig into this. It's fascinating and honestly pretty crucial stuff. Okay, so let's jump right into the science. What's the source material telling us is driving this intensity people are observing? It feels like more than just a feeling. There's actual data here.
There is.
The article points first to climate change, and specifically warmer oceans. I think the analogy used was that warmer water is like rocket fuel for these storms.
That's a good way to put it. Yep.
And the source even gives a specific number. Water needs to be at least 26.5 Celsius, that's about 79.7 Fahrenheit, just for a hurricane to form.
And the scale of that warming, according to the article, it's significant. Data cited shows the Atlantic sea surface temperatures are up by about 1 degree Celsius, so 1.8 Fahrenheit, just since 1900.
Wow. Okay.
And get this, a 2024 report mentioned in the source, it noted a record high 29 degrees Celsius, which is 84.2 Fahrenheit in parts of the Caribbean during the peak 2024 season.
29 Celsius. That's incredibly warm for the ocean.
It is. And this isn't just a minor thing. That extra heat fundamentally increases the energy available. It basically supercharges the storms.
Okay, so warmer ocean, more fuel. Huge factor. But is it only about the water temp, according to the source, or are there other things going on in the atmosphere?
No, it's definitely not just the ocean heat. The article talks about how atmospheric factors kind of combine with that warmth. Things like lower atmospheric pressure systems and, importantly, higher moisture levels in the air.
Right, creating a more favorable environment.
Exactly. It sort of sets the stage for what the source calls a perfect storm environment.
And that atmospheric moisture, there was a specific statistic on that in the source, wasn't there? It seems like I remember reading something pretty stark.
Yeah, there was. A 2023 study they referenced found that the moisture content over the Atlantic has gone up by 7% per decade since 1980.
7% per decade.
Per decade. So more moisture means these storms can potentially dump a lot more rain. That's a huge part of the damage, the flooding. And those lower pressure systems you mentioned, they help enable something called rapid intensification.
Ah, yes. Rapid intensification. The source defined that pretty clearly.
It did. It's when wind speeds jump by at least 30 knots. That's about 35 miles per hour in just a 24-hour period.
That just sounds terrifyingly fast. And the source gave a really recent potent example, Hurricane Ian in 2024.
Great. Yeah.
It went from Category 1 to Category 4 in just 18 hours. 18. And the article notes NOAA predicts this kind of thing, this rapid strengthening. It's likely to become more common.
Yeah, unfortunately. So you put it all together, right? The warmer oceans providing the raw energy, that increased moisture, loading the storms with more rain, and then these atmospheric conditions allowing them to strengthen incredibly fast.
The source makes a strong case that, yes, these factors are combining to make storms potentially more powerful and dangerous.
So that's the science pointing to why they might be getting stronger. What about recent trends? Does the source material show us what these more powerful storms have actually looked like? Give us some real-world examples. It definitely does. The article points to some recent major hurricanes as, well, stark illustrations. Hurricane Maria in 2017 is a big one they discuss.
Right, in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, Category 5. It just obliterated infrastructure there. A government report from 2018 cited in the source documented 90% of the island lost power for months, 60,000 people displaced.
Months without power.
And the intensity stats mentioned are just staggering. 175 mile-per-hour winds, 20 inches of rain causing massive landslides and floods. It was devastating.
And bringing it closer maybe to the mainland U.S. for many listeners, the article details Hurricane Ian again in 2024.
Yes, Ian.
A Category 4 hitting Florida. Source notes it became the costliest hurricane in Florida's history. I think the NHC estimate was around $112 billion in damage.
That's the figure. And the specifics of Ian's impact, as laid out in the article, they're really sobering. A massive 12-foot storm surge just swamped Fort Myers Beach, damage stretching, 5 miles inland in places?
5 miles inland.
Yeah. And the material brings up Ian's rapid intensification again, how quickly it spun up. And critically, the source points out that evacuation orders, well, they came too late for some. Tragically, 149 deaths resulted, mostly from drowning.
Wow, so it's not just the peak strength, but how fast they get there and how much rain they dump. That combination seems to be the really destructive pattern highlighted.
That's exactly the pattern the source identifies as troubling. And the rainfall increase, specifically, it's quantified. There's a 2025 study in Science referenced in the article. It found hurricane rainfall rates have climbed by 8% per decade since 1980.
8% per decade. That's on top of the moisture increase.
Right. It dramatically worsens flood risks. The source really frames this as a major wake-up call, especially for coastal communities, highlighting that urgent need for better preparation.
Okay, so given these trends, given the science, what do the experts predict for the future? What does the source material suggest we should brace for?
Well, the article talks about how scientists use these, advanced computer models to look at long-term trends. And the picture they paint, frankly, it's concerning.
How so?
It points to the IPCC's 2024 report. That report projects that if global warming keeps going at the current pace, about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade, the actual proportion of hurricanes reaching Category 4 and 5 strength could increase by 10% by the year 2050.
A 10% increase just in the proportion of those most intense storms.
Yes. And the article adds context from FEMA data, those Cat 4s and 5s. They're responsible for something like 85% of all hurricane-related damage in the U.S.
85%. So even a modest-sounding percentage increase in those storms means a huge potential jump in damage.
Precisely.
Does the source material touch on natural cycles? Things like El Nino, La Nina? How do they fit into this picture? Do they kind of complicate things?
They do play a role, yeah. The source explains they mainly influence year-to-year variability, mostly through affecting wind shear. La Nina years, like 2024 was, often see more hurricanes because there's less wind shear in the Atlantic, which lets storms organize and grow more easily.
Okay, so La Nina can mean a busier season.
Generally, yes. And the article also mentions the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, the AM. It's another natural climate pattern, a longer-term shift in Atlantic sea surface temps.
Right, AM.
Data from a 2023 NOAA study suggests we've been in a warm phase of the AO since about 1995, and that could last maybe another decade. That warm phase also tends to amplify Atlantic activity.
So you have these natural cycles causing ups and downs, but what does the source emphasize as the main driver, the underlying trend we should really focus on?
The material is pretty clear on this. The overarching trend of human-caused climate change is a dominant factor pushing things upward. Global temperatures are projected to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2035. So that steady warming trend, it basically keeps raising the baseline for storm intensity, regardless of whether it's an El Nino year or a La Nina year or where we are in the AMO cycle.
So the floor keeps rising, essentially.
That's a good way to think about it. And the article brings back Hurricane Maria, that 2017 storm, as an example of the kind of intense event we might see more frequently. It reiterates the devastating human cost, nearly 3,000 deaths attributed to it, and that huge economic toll, the NHC estimated $91.6 billion.
It's definitely clear that stronger storms are a major threat. But let's talk specifics from the source material. Who and what is actually most impacted by these changes?
Well, the article really focuses first on coastal communities, and for obvious reasons, it highlights a pretty striking statistic from 2020 census data. 40% of the entire U.S. population lives in these coastal areas.
40%, that's a huge number of people.
It is, and their risk is being compounded by rising sea levels.
Yeah.
The source mentions global sea levels are already up 8 inches since 1880. But significantly, 3 inches of that rise happened just in the last 25 years. NOAA data cited shows it's accelerating.
So the pace is picking up.
Exactly. And a 2024 USGS report referenced in the source, it predicts sea levels along the U.S. Gulf Coast could rise another 1.5 feet by 2050.
Another 1.5 feet
Yeah.
on top of what's already happened.
Yes. So you combine that higher baseline sea level with the storm surge from these stronger hurricanes. It makes the surges far more deadly, pushing water much further inland. The article uses Hurricane Ian's 15-foot surge reaching 5 miles inland as that really concrete, frankly terrifying example.
15 feet, 5 miles inland.
Yeah.
And critical infrastructure, I imagine that's highly vulnerable too. The source touched on that.
Oh, absolutely. Infrastructure vulnerability is a huge concern raised in the material. It notes that during Ian, 90% of Florida's power grid got knocked out,
90%.
leaving 2.7 million people without power, some for weeks. Think about the cascading effects of that.
Yeah, hospitals, communication, everything. Okay, so beyond the direct human impact and infrastructure, the source also detailed broader environmental consequences, right? How are ecosystems faring with these stronger storms?
Ecosystems are definitely taking a hit, according to the article. It talks about coral reefs, which are already stressed by generally warmer waters. These intense hurricane seasons can cause further damage from temperature spikes during the storms themselves. The Nature Conservancy reported 30% of Caribbean reefs suffered damage during the 2024 hurricane season alone.
30% in one season.
Yeah. And then there's saltwater intrusion. When massive storm surges push seawater inland, it contaminates freshwater sources. The article mentions this happened in the Everglades after Ian, disrupting habitats for sensitive species.
Like which ones?
Well, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission noted populations of species like the American crocodile actually dropped by 15% in 2024, linked to the habitat changes post-Ian. And mangroves, too. Mangrove forests are incredibly important natural barriers. They buffer coastlines from storm surge. But the source cites a 2023 University of Miami study showing a 5% decline in mangrove coverage since 2010. They're losing ground.
And is impacts, they don't just stay isolated, right?
No, the source explains how these things ripple through entire food chains. It threatens biodiversity and, importantly, impacts human livelihoods, too, especially things like fishing industries that depend on healthy coastal ecosystems.
This all paints a picture of, well, real urgency. So, given everything we've pulled from the source material, let's pivot to solutions. What practical steps can you, our listeners, or your communities take right now to prepare for these stronger storms?
The article lays out several key areas for preparation, kind of on different scales. At the community level, it really emphasizes the need to update and bolster infrastructure.
Like seawalls.
Yeah, coastal cities investing in things like seawalls, flood barriers, better drainage. Miami's $4 billion resilience plan, which launched in 2023, is highlighted as an example. That includes projects like physically raising roads and installing advanced water pumping systems.
So big public works type projects. What about individual homes?
For homeowners, the advice is about retrofitting. Things like installing hurricane shutters, reinforcing roofs to better withstand high winds. FEMA estimates, cited in the source, suggest these kinds of retrofits can cut potential storm damage by as much as 60%.
60% reduction. That's significant.
It really is. It makes a huge difference.
Okay, so that's strengthening the physical structures. What about personal and family preparedness? What does the source advise there?
Developing clear evacuation plans is presented as absolutely crucial. And knowing your specific evacuation zone. The article stresses this because, remember, it pointed out that during Ian, about 30% of residents ignored evacuation orders.
Right, and confusion was a factor.
Yeah, a 2025 University of Florida survey suggested confusion over zones was a big part of it. So, know your zone. The material also advises having a go bag ready.
The go bag?
Yeah.
Standard advice, but important.
Crucial. Packed with essentials. Water, non-perishable food, medications, important documents, and critically, have planned evacuation routes, specifically routes heading inland, figured out ahead of time. Don't wait until the order comes.
So planning and basic supplies seem fundamental.
Exactly. Knowledge and supplies. Education is key here, too. The article suggests communities should be hosting workshops to really inform residents about the risks and how to prepare. It cites NHC data showing only 40% of Gulf Coast residents felt truly prepared back in 2024.
Only 40%. Room for improvement there.
Definitely. And stocking up on supplies is vital. The recommendation is usually a week's worth of water. The guideline is a gallon per person per day, plus non-perishable food, batteries, flashlights, first aid kit.
And generators. Power outages are a huge issue.
Generators can be absolutely vital, yes. The source highlights USDA estimates that after Ian, power outages led to something like $500 million worth of spoiled food statewide in Florida alone. A generator can prevent that, keep essentials running.
Okay. Infrastructure, personal plans, supplies. What about the bigger picture? Does the source mention advocacy?
It does, yeah. It explicitly brings up advocating for broader climate action. The logic presented is that reducing greenhouse gas emissions will, over the long term, slow down ocean warming, which is the fundamental driver we talked about.
So tackling the root cause.
Exactly. The article gives examples like simple actions, planting trees, supporting renewable energy initiatives, and it notes that global emissions actually did see a small dip, about 5% in 2024, partly due to efforts like these, citing International Energy Agency data. So individual and collective action on climate is framed as part of the long-term preparation strategy.
And with that, I think we bring this deep dive to a close. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, really digging into the source material. We explored the core science, explaining why hurricanes seem to be getting stronger, that crucial link between warmer oceans acting as fuel and those atmospheric shifts bringing more moisture and enabling rapid intensification.
Right. And we looked at those powerful recent examples like Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Ian, seeing the truly devastating real-world impacts these stronger, rapidly intensifying storms can have. We also touched on what the future might hold based on scientific models that concerning projection of potentially more Category 4 and 5 storms in the coming decades.
We also spent time discussing the wide-ranging impacts, didn't we? Not just the immediate threat to vulnerable coastal communities and the strain on critical infrastructure, but also the significant harm being done to vital coastal ecosystems, from coral reefs to mangroves and the species that depend on them.
Mhm. And importantly, we outline those practical, actionable steps drawn directly from the source material things individuals and communities can do. From strengthening homes and infrastructure to making detailed personal evacuation plans, stocking essential supplies, and even the role of broader advocacy for climate action.
The evidence presented in the source material seems pretty clear. The nature of the hurricane threat is changing, it's evolving. But understanding the science behind it, and crucially, taking proactive steps based on that knowledge, that seems to be how we can best prepare for and face these challenges. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It's definitely a critical topic, one that, as the source underscores, really demands our attention and ongoing preparation.
Absolutely. And maybe just one final thought for you to consider based on everything we've unpacked from this material today. Thinking about that rapid intensification, how Hurricane Ian, for example, spun up so incredibly fast, catching communities off guard, how might we need to fundamentally rethink our traditional approaches, specifically around evacuation planning and communication? How do we warn people effectively when a storm can become so dangerous so quickly?
That's a really challenging question, isn't it? And one the trends highlighted in the material certainly force us to confront.
Something to definitely keep thinking about. Thanks again for joining us.